This is Unforgettable Learning, where we talk to L&D visionaries, experts, and mavericks about performance, creativity, and tech. Subscribe to stay in touch. It's the last episode of the season of the Unforgettable Learning Podcast, and we've had the most fantastic 1.5 year run for this season. It's been brilliant to speak to so many experts in the field of L&D and beyond. And with this season coming to a close, Josh and I are having a look back at some of our highlights and reflecting on what unforgettable learning really means. Subscribers, look out for information in the new year about how Sponge will continue to bring you the latest exciting insights from the learning world. If you haven't already subscribed, you can do so through the link in the description below or via the buttons on Spotify and YouTube. Hey, Josh.
Hey, this is bittersweet. We've come at the end of the season, and we've had a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because it'll also help me sort of jog down memory lane of some of the highlights that we had in just some of the coolest conversations, I would say, with people in our field.
We've been really lucky to have such good guests, and maybe there's a bit of bias going on because we get the privilege of choosing some of our lovely guests, but I think that it's shown a kind of snapshot in time of where the learning industry is, where workplace and corporate kind of learning mindsets are, and bearing in mind where we've been. And if I really cast my mind back to, say, 15 plus years ago to today, there definitely feels like a sort of nuance and a maturity that is exciting to see. Where should we begin? I was just reminding me of how you always like to say we have the privilege of being the last mover. I was thinking, like, we're catching up, there's definitely some innovators in our space now.
we definitely do, and maybe that's a good place to kind of pick up, is because for me, when I look at sort of the totality of our conversations, it's been great to, on one side, have this. I always find there's always just great moments of catharsis whenever you speak to people that you don't go, oh, I'm going through the exact same things you are. And obviously, from our perspective, our clients are going through very specific things as well, too, in the same way. So on one side, it's nice to know that we're going through the same challenges, and even 15 years later, some things never change. But at the same time, much like you, I do sense a maturity. I do sense movement, and I do sense certainly one of my passion points is strategic momentum. We are starting to see that we are not only focusing on great design, building great learning experience, and as from even some of our more recent conversations, a fantastic emphasis on learner-focused outcomes, but also what that means for the value you can create for an organization. I think to the point of being a last mover, I feel like coming out of this, I have the privilege of being a last mover, of taking all this good stuff. And I hope our listeners do the same thing as well, too. Taking all this good stuff and saying, what's my next move now? And that's an exciting moment when I think of just sort of you and I have been lucky enough to be in all these conversations.
Yes, we really have. Well, let's speak a bit to that business problem then, this idea of the strategic momentum. If one person really kind of put us on the map in that conversation, it was no doubt Serena. I mean, I think lots of people have touched on this too. But one of the things I really kind of loved about our conversation with Serena is that she just emphasized this point of, if L&D positions themselves as someone who just makes courses, and we start with content libraries and platforms, and the mistaken belief that every action gets a reaction, like people are going to learn if we create stuff, which hasn't worked since school, then we really are in for trouble,
Yeah.
But that seems to have, for the longest time, been our kind of default position is to dash towards content and courses and infrastructure and environments and content. And she was the complete opposite of that. And she really said, we start with the business problem, which is obvious, but she explained how she does that in such a clever, mature, thoughtful way. And I think you said, run to the business problem first. And I love that phrase because still we have to remind ourselves, how do we translate what is presenting as a need for content creation to kind of backpedal into the real need, the real problem, the real thing we're trying to solve. Is it reducing attrition? Is it time to competency? What is it that we're trying to solve? And this cropped up in Kevin Yates as well. But yeah, what did you take from that about the sort of strategic side of things?
Well, first of all, that's Dr. Serena to the both of us,
You're right.
as she's demonstrated in her
Serena,
incredible
yes.
accomplishment.
With her peer, yeah.
What I enjoyed about our conversation with Serena was I love speaking to learning leaders that are in-house in orgs, because I personally believe that is the greatest sort of stretch of change that you can do, being a learning leader and actually doing that meaningful connection with the business. And just the language in which Serena spoke, I think was the biggest takeaway. If I'm a learning leader as well, kind of looking into how can you emulate that? She wasn't, to your point, talking about content, talking about LMSs. She was talking about what the business was trying to solve. And she just kept the focus there. And no matter how much even the business themselves was trying to bring her away to, okay, but what are the workshops and the facilitations? Like, no. What are the metrics? What are the business problems? I think the piece for me that also really kind of illuminated how she was thinking and tackling the challenge was, out of nowhere came the realm of psychological safety. How do I, as a learning leader, create the right environment for people to learn? Because if I don't create the right environment, of which we know motivation is a part of there, safe enough to be able to meaningfully apply what you're trying to do, all of that, we don't talk enough about the requirements, the ingredients that are required to actually build great learning, so that when the content actually comes in, it's so much more powerful, so much stronger when you do it. And so that for me was one of the biggest takeaways from that conversation, was a business leader who knew how to talk about learning, but was spending more time talking about the environment of learning as opposed to the content of learning.
Yeah. Do you know what? It reminds me of, I studied creativity in organizations, of what makes organizations creative, looked a lot at this from different perspectives. There's another thinker, Teresa Amabile, who talks about, I don't know if I say her name correctly, but she talks about the conditions that are required for creativity to thrive in an organization. And that psychological safety that you've just alluded to, also that's there for permission for any kind of behavior, permission for risk-taking, permission for creative risk-taking, permission for me to make a mistake and fail and learn. And a lot of that was around how can a culture set themselves up for success in that way. And it really does come down from the top. If these things are not supported at the top of the organization, you're going to see tension, you're going to see difficulties, people feeling a lack of permission. And it is interesting to think about, well, what is it? There's a level of confidence that someone like Dr. Serena would have in being able to explain to other senior leaders, it's really important that we get that right, because otherwise we're not going to have an environment in which people feel safe to take mistakes, safe to learn, safe to fail, safe to practice, safe to generate value in our organization. And sometimes it makes me think, is there enough scope for learning leaders to do that in a company where they're not, these companies we work in are huge, but I guess they can be example setters within their domain, creating permission and safety in their own departments. Do you think?
Well, I think a couple of things on that. I think the reason why Serena succeeds is because she is equally holding the business in one hand and has a tremendous empathy for her people in the other hand. And she knows when to wield each special tool when is relevant. And I think what gives her success is that she's got a strong performance focus. I'm trying to impact these metrics, and this is what needs to be true to actually impact these metrics, which is actually a really, and if I were to think back to all of our conversations, it's always those simple truths that emerge that make you go, oh, right, yeah, I mean, of course. And then you look at it in a new light and you're like, oh, it's actually a lot harder to do. And for me, this is one of those things, is that she can delve into realms of learning culture only by going through a performance focus first. And I find that is the right way. I think that is the strategic way of doing it. And it also just us talking about it and reflecting back now makes me think of actually something that we use at Sponge called the 3E framework, which is experiences, environments, and evidence. And that's really our frame for how we calibrate any learning experience. But our sort of take on it is, to equate experiences typically with content, but take a step back. But environments, we tend to associate that as a tech environment, when really it's much bigger than that. When we're thinking about the realms of psychological safety, learning culture, is what is the right environment for learning to thrive? And that gives me kind of pause for how exactly we would think about our 3Es. There's a human element to environment. It isn't just about SCORM compliance or, things or making
Tools being
sure
available or that kind of
yeah.
thing. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's a good example of sort of the rigidity and the mindset shift for a lot of us in learning about, well, my life is only about courses on LMSs. When we have a great conversation with someone like Serena who says, well, actually, keep the focus on what the business is trying to accomplish and have a much broader, expansive view of what experiences and environments actually look like.
In that model, what does experiences mean? Not just learning experiences, but experiences of work, or what does that mean?
Experiences mostly tied to an output that might have a content bias, as an example. And so there's a specific codified experience, but the experience can be more than content. It could be a workshop, it could be shadowing, it could be, it's a broad perspective. And I think it's the linkage between what's the right experience and the right environment. And it's almost a Venn diagram of two of how they can help each other thrive. And then, of course, bringing that element of evidence, which is super important, coming back to that performance focus, is like, well, what is the point of even having these experiences and these environments?
Well, you've talked about evidence, and someone who we also spoke with was Kevin Yates, and that was a fantastic chat. And one of the things that he said that really kind of struck me and has stuck with me is, he said, in my 25 plus years in training and learning, I haven't seen one instance where training and learning did something by itself, but I have seen it where in combination it has. And I thought that was a really honest, kind of humbling, but also quite exciting perspective on gathering evidence to make a difference, on the evidence that's needed on the impact that learning and training can have. Basically, it's not just going to do it by itself. And so when we kind of dug into what other things would contribute, to your point about environment, he talks about compensation and rewards and recognition, and Laurie mentioned that too, and tools and performance support and manager coaching and mentoring and all these other things, culture of the organization, even the environment in the marketplace, which I thought was interesting, because I think employees do sense shifts in the marketplace, especially now with things like AI. And so I just wonder what you think about that, and what you see in the projects that Sponge is working on.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. And I think it's sort of one of the larger narratives I encounter when I speak to our customers, when I speak to any sort of learning leader that is kind of trying to extract impact. And I find that we know the nuances of isolating learning to the effects of performance. We know that. But I almost feel like it's a defeatist argument. And we put so much pressure on ourselves and overwhelmed by, well, how can I possibly prove the ROI of my learning, that we almost just eject ourselves from the conversation entirely. And so where I definitely share a similar view with Kevin Yates on this is, for me, the ultimate piece when it comes to impact measurement is do whatever you need to do to move the needle in your organization. Don't worry about Kirkpatrick this or LTEM that. Don't worry about going to a trade fair, seeing this amazing data-driven presentation and be like, oh man, I'm so far away. Where's the organization today? And this is where I'm always inspired by James Clear's Atomic Habits. I find it's a really powerful book. He's a big proponent of 1% incremental change. Don't try and swing for the fences. Try and think of that 1% incremental. How can I help my organization be more data-driven tomorrow? And the way you do that is with just relentless pragmatism. Don't worry about, to the quote that you pulled out there, go find some partnership across the business. And don't worry about, oh, well, was it 20% tied to L&D or 40% tied? Like, we don't need to get lost in it. What we do need to know, and this is where the strategic side of kind of business alignment, getting the right budgets, all those things matter, is that just be part of the narrative. We know that we solved the problem as a business, and hopefully you're working with a cross-functional group that is relatively egoless, and be a part of that narrative as opposed to being outside of that narrative. And all of a sudden that gives you more confidence to say, well, maybe the next attempt we can figure out whether it was 20 or 40%. So my view and just sort of my love for that quote is, we just need a good strong dose of pragmatism, because we get overwhelmed very quickly, and some progress is better than no progress.
Yeah, that's it. Being practical, being pragmatic. And Peter Manish also kind of echoed that sentiment by saying, change takes time. It's he acknowledged also, which I thought was really interesting, that actually organizations, perhaps before partners get involved with them, need to kind of have their data either figured out or some sort of sense of where their data is going to come from before asking the impossible task of a partner to come and kind of give them some trackable metrics. So that felt like wisdom as well. These things are kind of tough, but that doesn't mean we avoid them. We have tenacity and we can get them done.
And talk about just a profound conversation with Peter in terms of just someone who's on the frontier of pushing the limits in-house of what exactly even is the role of learning in an organization, and what are we trying to do. And sometimes we also need that healthy dose of why do we exist and what are we actually trying to do. And to kind of and to maybe even cross-reference a couple of conversations, we know Serena left us with this powerful quote about L&D being a value creator for the business, and I think Peter obviously is aligned to that ethos as well too, is that when we take a step back and we say we don't exist to just crank the old L&D engine and get training to people, but rather solve complex problems and partner across the business, it gives you almost like a shot of energy, into the arm for that's why I exist. And certainly when you think of, the trends that constantly kind of hit our shores, and we had a great conversation with Egla about it, who's, a great voice in terms of AI and L&D. She was loud and clear on, if this is the moment for you to really ask yourselves why L&D exists, because AI will help accelerate whatever you think that is. And if you think you exist to create content and optimize content, go down that path and you'll see where it goes. But if you think L&D exists as a business partner, or L&D exists to accelerate performance, or tackle that incredibly hard, nuanced place of human behavior and how to use that to achieve outcomes, AI can be tremendously helpful. But use this moment really wisely, because you can also use it as a blunt instrument, and it'll only take you so far. So just all three of those conversations really kind of echoing, as we talked about at the beginning, about sort of the winds of change, the maturity of there's opportunity here if you want to grab it. And might be scary, might be ambitious, might be bold, but hopefully we've been inspired by a lot of the conversations we've had this season to say, well, there are people that are doing it and are finding success.
I love that you talk, when you say sort of tackling human behavior. And in a way, that identity shift is something that came up with Laurie as well when we were speaking to her, because she introduced this idea, certainly it was new for me, of getting a chief skills officer. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting new kind of role. I can see the value of it. And just, understanding where the organization is going and where L&D will play a role in that. And she talked about right skilling, making learning as efficient as possible, of course, so people can get the skills they need to stay relevant. What did you think about Laurie's idea of the chief skills officer?
It was such in some ways it was a great validation of the perpetual sort of existential crisis that I think we face as learning leaders. But on the other side, it was a reminder for me, and me, I always sort of have a business bias towards looking at these things, of which lane are we playing in? And I often like to go down sort of philosophical journeys with those that are willing to come with me on why we exist and what we're really trying to do. And for me, the key theme here is people enablement. Where there are people, and people at least for now, until Skynet comes for us, people are at the center of every business. And where there is the need for people to create value, there's always going to be learning. And the interesting piece of sort of the idea of skills and a chief skills officer was, what is the partnership, or even maybe even the silos, of having someone who's solely responsible for the skill side of what the future of an organization looks like, needs, how we get people there. It's almost the skill task and the enablement task as sort of the dividing lines that I would see between that. And so on one side, I think if you were a little bit afraid, you would say, oh, is skills coming to take away L&D's job? But on the other side is, well, actually, skills is doing something that's really focused and important for the future of the workforce, and enablement will still need to be there. But perhaps the skills movement is forcing us to rethink some of the dominating activities, the courses, the off the shelf, all of those things, forcing us to rethink the logic of, is that the right way to bring people on board faster, more efficiently? Because much like the pandemic forced us to rethink a lot of different things, we are moving so quickly in terms of pace of change that training can be too slow. And we need to be more agile to respond to the ambiguous nature of the world and where it's going. And we need to find new ways to enable people, and learning has a role in it. So another fantastic conversation that has got me still thinking about it in terms of, well, as a digital learning agency, as someone who supports people in terms of people enablement, what's the future of that going to look like?
Yeah. Yeah. And who were you thinking of? Who shaped that for you?
That was Lori.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That was Lori's provocation with skills and the chief skills officer.
And she was extremely clear that skills as a taxonomy does not live with the L&D team. That isn't your remit. Our role is to help enable exactly that, enable those skills. I was jumping ahead because I was thinking of the chat we had with JD, who said that this has to become the year of the managers, because I was thinking about skills at all levels. And this middle tier of people, he really kind of highlighted me to think about a bit more, and the importance of them. Most people are learning from their managers very directly. Managers are sort of squashed in the middle because they have pressures from above and, tasks from below. In many cases, they're often doing the role as well. And, if they're sort of customer facing and frontline, that's kind of an important direct access to where your training success hits your customer. Immediately you're going to see those results. And what he said was something interesting. He said we need to tear down the role to find the skills and ask, what do these people really need to do? How do we enable them effectively? How do we measure them effectively? And how do we compensate them? So it's this collaboration, back to your sort of point earlier about between L&D, HR and operations. And I thought that was a nice, astute observation for thinking about roles in the round and skills in the round, and as a collaboration across departments. I mean, holistically, it feels like an appropriate way to think about skills. Do you see that happening in organizations, people tearing down roles? I mean, I know we can just pull in skills taxonomies from anywhere, but I mean, what do you think is the best way organizations can... There are so many roles in organizations and so many skills to be identified that can be different from one to the next. I don't know if you've got any perspective on that or if you're seeing that happening.
I think we're in really interesting times in terms of orgs understanding the best way to get the skills they need for their workforce. Because, I mean, we've been hearing this for decades. Some stat will always come up of, well, we don't know 50% of the jobs that will exist 30 years from now, all that kind of stuff. And I think we're finding the traditional post a job, find someone who meets the job requirements. It's just not as successful a strategy as, let's look inside our own org, and certainly for global complex organizations where they've got a huge sample size of population to work with. It's in their best interest to actually grow careers, invest in reskilling those individuals, because they become your ambassadors. They become those and that's how you keep them engaged. And to the point of managers, to the point of engagement, I read a Gallup report recently, and they came up with this crazy stat about lost productivity due to engagement is costing the world something like $9 trillion in GDP. Just a crazy stat.
Lost
But
productivity due to engagement or
yeah,
disengagement?
disengagement,
Got
disengagement.
it. Okay,
Yeah,
just checking.
yeah. Engagement being
I'm
there's a lack
jazzed.
of engagement.
Lack of
Yeah,
it. Got it.
yeah, and of which managers are the
Yeah,
most direct
pivotal.
influence to
Yeah.
employee engagement. And so on one side, there's an org need to get skills right. But on the other side, there is the world of people and HR that need to get skills right for the sake of getting people to stay invested in their employer relationship, that employee value proposition. How do we enrich that properly? So getting that side of the story right is becoming really emergent now, certainly amidst quiet quitting, certainly amidst newer generations that are not as loyal to their employer as the ones previously too. This is this is an issue. This is an issue in the workforce now that organizations are scrambling to solve. And one of the ways that you do it, you simply just give more agency to individuals to say, build your own career here. We want you to build your own career here. And let's invest in the skills so that it doesn't have to be one vertical straight ladder, but it can be whatever you want it to be. Now, that's the dream. That's the vision. The other side of the conversation is it's hard to break down those things. Certainly, and certainly in my experience, speaking to different cultures of organizations, regionally, industry specific, this is a huge shift for a lot where they insist on their hierarchies because they work. And they like it on one side because it's very rigid lines. And certainly when you're talking about pay transparency and stuff like that. But on the other side, there's the risk of losing talent, disengaged talent. And so, as I mentioned, we're in a really interesting moment for those that are really trying to be progressive and those that are insisting on their ways.
You know, Chad gave us a really nice example of something that he was working on where a real world kind of impact occurred. And I was just thinking about it now because this is a really interesting demonstration of skill plus AI that ties together a lot of the themes. And it was about reducing errors in product inventory. So prior to this intervention, reps would go into an eyewear company and it would take them around 20 minutes to figure out what the inventory was because these sunglasses looked almost exactly the same, and unless you were extremely experienced you couldn't easily tell the difference. And so there was just this tiny nuance of knowledge. So how could we solve that? We could solve that with more training. That would be very time consuming, take a long time. Think how many inventories have passed before that solution comes to pass. But what they did instead is they used some technology, some AR technology, to help recognize what the different eyewear products were. Sounds simple, but obviously there's a lot of machine learning to be trained in understanding which each of those different frames were. And what the result was that it then increased accuracy to 87% from 60% prior, and an inventory process that previously took 20% went down to 20 minutes went down to 5 minutes. And I love that example. It feels like an example for the times because we couldn't have done that 15 years ago. We couldn't have employed that technology. And there's now a kind of a new skill of being able to get round as many. I can pull in more inventories today now, and so I'm going to, I don't know, maybe you can meet your quota more quickly. I'm not sure, but I just thought that was a very nice, tangible example of today's tech really catching up to a performance need in the field.
Well, and it's a good crossover for sort of the emergent role of AI in this conversation. And so,
yeah.
And this is where Laurie was right in saying that skills shouldn't be the domain of L&D, because I think in L&D, you have a bias towards training. You have a bias towards, well, the answer must be through some sort of learning intervention. But through that example that you just mentioned, you're looking at what are the skills required.
Yeah.
And there's a fine division there of, and what if those skills need to be human?
Yeah.
Versus what are those skills where, my assumption is in that activity, that was a human-led activity, and particularly an expertise skill. There's only a select people that know that fine difference when they look at it too. And if we're saying, well, actually, technology can do it and do it better and do it faster, all of a sudden there's a shift in the skills need for that job. And this is the difference between a job versus the skills around it of,
Yeah.
well, maybe we can create more time. And this is the angel and the devil of the AI conversation. We can create more time for that type of role to focus on other things or do it at scale and focus their human skills on this activity and allow the technology to do something with an accuracy and proficiency that would just be beyond human capability, right? And that's certainly our AI point of view at Sponges is that when you're trying to think of how AI can make a dramatic shift, let's not talk about production efficiency. Ask yourself, what is beyond the realm of human capability in terms of speed, in terms of scale, in terms of impact? That's the place you want to play in when it comes to AI. And it may or may not involve learning. But it's a much more fantastic use of AI than it is about trying to build courses faster,
Yes, definitely. Now, I know that you love and always speak up for the business need, and so do I, but I also do want to defend content as well. And mostly because I'm a designer at heart, I think. And one of the conversations I loved and valued, it was very early on in our series, was with Patty Moore. So she said something incredible. She said, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of design. And if you think about that, I start to get surreal, like ergonomics, like why are door handles where they are? If they were just up here, it would be a little bit more inconvenient every single moment of my day, everything. Why are they that, and you can go off on one. But the example that she gave was around blood pressure reduction pills being in a tablet pot that is so hard to open. If you are having a blood pressure problem, it's going through the roof and you can't, it's skyrocketing. And it's such a beautiful crystallized picture for me of how we must always remember to design for the people for whom we are creating things, and not for our own egos, not for our own selves, not for our SMEs, not for anyone else. We have to go to where the audience is and bring this humanity and this just continual emphasis on universal design. So I love that. It was echoed to by Julie Dirkson, who just talks about if you don't understand where your audience is, she says, you're going to be left just saying it louder and more frequently. Again, another brilliant piece of wisdom. We don't need to shout at people who already know how to do this thing. We actually just need to get the solution right for where they are. So two brilliant thinkers that I just wanted to highlight, because design is one of my favorite topics, and that human-centered thing was echoed loudly there.
Well, and first of all, what a profound quote. And then I certainly think focusing on the business and thinking of beautiful design don't have to be at odds with each other. And
Josh.
and I think actually the biggest breakthroughs are when we use beautiful design to solve business problems. And they feel like they're different worlds, but actually when you force them to collide sometimes, they actually create some really beautiful things. And so I just absolutely love that quote. And it reminded me of actually, to your point of door handles, I'll give me 60 seconds to air my grievances on door handles, because as I think I'm left-handed. And I had this moment yesterday where I cursed for about 60 seconds about living in a right-handed person's world, because door handles, of course, are set up for right-handed people. And I had this moment where I had the keys to the door in my left-hand pocket, and both my hands were sort of filled up, and I couldn't reach my pocket because my hands were completely full. But I keep my keys in my left-handed pocket because of my dominant hand. And I realized, well, I couldn't reach with my left hand to it because, of course, the door handles is on the right hand of the door. So to the point of the quality of your life is based on the design around you, it works both ways. And ask any left-handed person, and they will tell you about how the design of our world is the bane of our existence sometimes, depending on what it means to do it. But to your point, some of the sort of the great conversations we had, I also think of our conversation with Lisa over at TSO, who took such a user-focused approach to how we help people earn their certification, pass their tests, become confident, competent, empathetic drivers, something I think the world needs a lot more these days. It's coming back to these sort of simple truisms. It's amazing when you put the people at the center of your experience, what results you find.
It's so true. And that was a lovely conversation with Lisa, because she really understood not only the need to get certified as a young person, for instance, if you were a young person taking your driving test, but the sort of psychological, emotional pressures that they were under, and they'd really designed for that whole experience, the holistic experience, and that felt really smart. I don't know how many people are doing that. And actually, when I chatted to Dave Kelly, that was another really great chat. We talked about some emergent themes coming up in 2024, and he said something nice too about going back to the problem, I guess tying everything together really. He says, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The question we always ask ourselves. But then he said something interesting. He said, what's the least disruptive way of solving this problem? And what technologies do I have available to me to do that? And he said, be curious to broaden your lens between what you think you have available and what you might have available to you. And I just found that very striking, because there can be a tendency, especially in our industry where new technologies come along, where new and exciting sort of things seem to be a good way of solving a problem. It doesn't maybe mean that they're the least disruptive. It perhaps means that we're going to be introducing friction into people's days to pick up something new or introduce another thing that they don't want to do. And that was a sort of sobering but brilliant insight, I thought, from Dave Kelly.
It's coming back to the design conversation. Design doesn't need to be over-designed. And sometimes I'm a big fan of minimalism, so this just this comes enormously with me. And I'll give you a good example, which I think might put a bee in your bonnet. I think of the I just remembered that phrase, and I'm using it all week because I find it's just great.
It's not one that's it's not a North American
it's not one of my usual vocabulary.
Well,
and I was like, oh yeah, that was a good one. I'm going to bring that one back. Because who has a bonnet these days anyway, right?
Well, I do have a spider in my car, as we established recently, so it's a similar irk.
Spider in your glove compartment might be the one.
Modern.
But it reminded me of sort of disruption in terms of interventions, and I think of certainly in my world and the conversations I have, probably the biggest disruption in terms of in the flow of work versus sort of reality and practicality is something like VR. Mm-hmm. VR, when it has this extremely focused use case, is really beneficial. But if you're just leading with the novelty of it, leading with the, I want to win an award and I feel like VR is the right way to do it, that quote resonates with me big time. It's like, is it worth the disruption? Is it worth the infrastructure, the logistics? Is it worth the investment? There's disruption is on a lot of different levels there. And so that's always kind of been a bit of a bugbear for me, is that I love VR. I love immersive experiences. I love design. I love storytelling. I love all of those things. It doesn't have to be VR. And in the realm of designing for minimalist disruption, is VR the best way to do it?
You're so right to ask that. And in a way, I think that's why I felt a little bit challenged by that provocation, because I
have a tendency to go towards VR, immersive and exciting things. And actually, I now realize, and actually Chad speaks to this too, is like, if you introduce friction to people's day, they're less likely to do it. We know this from our own behavior, so I don't know why I would think it would be different for anyone else. So I love that question. Well, look, we've had so many good conversations. We can't possibly kind of pack all of them into this, which is such a shame. But for anybody who's interested in hearing these chats, we've had people from Snap, from Google, from Lego, from Tesco, from so many fascinating people. Please do check out the podcast. I'm going to finish, Josh, by just asking you what you now think of as unforgettable learning.
Well, Kate, as you know, this is something you and I talk about almost daily, because we just find this is such a passionate place for conversation. And I would say that if anything, amidst all the different things that we need to counter, it has created for me the realm of this being a personal story more than anything else. Learning And you remember when we asked this question to certain individuals, and
Yeah.
for those that are listening to the audio side of things, I highly encourage you to actually watch the video side of things, because I want you to see the tone shift. I want you to see the change in people's faces when we asked them that question, because it became a personal moment of like the best learning, the deepest learning, the most enriching learning. It's almost like we went into a different place, and
Yeah.
and for me, that has been, amidst all the business conversation we've had, leaders in design, leaders in business, leaders in seeing how the workforce is a thing. The piece that shifted for me was this sort of universal storytelling component of unforgettable learning that always is. There's there's an inner depth to unlock in everyone when it comes to
Yes.
unforgettable
Yes.
learning. And that's what I've become fascinated by, is that how do I get to a depth of experience with you?
Yeah. I love
That, yeah. What about
That's
you? What
brilliant.
about you?
Again, like we've been talking about this for a long time, thinking about it for a long time, and I've also been reflecting on it personally. And where I am right now, where I've landed right now, is a kind of yin and yang, with a kind of a trigger and a healing, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I feel like some people have said that for them, unforgettable learning is invisible. You don't even know it's happening. And I believe that when you've almost like had a big trigger has happened, and then you've reflected on it and you've started to integrate and move things forward through practice, maybe habits, through whatever, a phased process. Maybe that's kind of practical, but it is like yin and yang. It's these two things. There's a break. There's something that happens, an inciting moment you would have in a story, and then a moment of repair, I guess, or figuring things out. And that's the invisible piece, which I love, because you're putting things back together and integrating what you've newly learned. But you had to have something happen in the first place for it to have been important enough for you to be motivated to want to continue.
That's such a great way to frame it, and it made me think of sort of a common theme I found in these conversations, was that people kept coming back to their childhood.
Yeah, that's true.
And
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time thinking of sort of like how mundane the workforce is, and pressures on productivity, flow of work, remote,
Right.
timesheets, all that kind of stuff. Is that there's something about wanting to come back to learning when it felt most precious and exciting and novel. That, for me, in putting a designer's lens on, that's the place I want to go to. That's the place that makes me go, that's how transformation starts. And when I think of tying now to the business side of things instantly, when I think about sort of the path of transformation, a lot of our customers' organizations are on such big bounds of transformation, and you want to bring your people on board.
Yes.
You have to start at that place. And so how can you reignite that spark, that love for learning that came in a very vivid place, to your place of trigger and healing? There's something vivid beneath the surface over there that we need to find in order to open up people, certainly in the workforce, where excitement isn't necessarily the top three requirements of your job. We need to ignite something deeply exciting within you, or vivid inside you, for the learning to truly happen.
I think you're right. And what we don't want to pick up, to Dr. Serena's point at the beginning of our talk, is the methods of school teaching. And we don't want to be the department that delivers you a school-like experience. We want the childlike wonder of learning to be at the core, not the mechanics of the classroom of the back along 80s and 90s, for example. What a rich chat. Thank you so much, Josh. It's been such a pleasure to run these podcasts with you, to host them together with you. I hope they've been as exciting for you as they have been for me, and as interesting for everybody to listen to them, as much as we've enjoyed doing them. Any parting words?
It was great co-hosting with you. I think I think we've got something here. Maybe there's a VR experience that might be worth elaborating on over here. So not going to crush that dream just yet. But you've honestly just made me actually want to go back and re-listen to some of these episodes. So hopefully we've inspired our listeners as well too. But yeah, this was a great chat as always.
It was a great chat. Thanks so much, Josh. See you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to stay up to date with leading lights from L&D and leave us a review to let us know what you think.